The prairie wind hit different in central Minnesota that winter of 1889 when Hans Larsen's cast iron stove burned 6 cords in 1 month and still left ice forming inside his walls. He had heated his farmhouse exactly the way every settler was told to. Standard iron stove, direct flue, hot air convection, proven and trusted. By February, the upstairs dropped to 38 degrees on minus 20-degree nights despite the fire running full blast. Across the prairie, immigrant families fought the same losing battle with stoves built by the book and failing by season. Over 3 winters, Larsen quietly adapted an old Swedish tile-clad technique that kept his house at 55 degrees upstairs, used half the wood, and radiated heat 12 hours after the fire died. What did he understand about storing heat that contractors ought to know? The morning after that February blizzard, Hans Larsen stepped outside his farmhouse into air so cold it burned his lungs and found his neighbor Thomas Fisher splitting kindling at sunrise, 3 hours earlier than usual. Fisher's face was drawn tight with exhaustion, his breath forming clouds that froze and fell like snow. Through the thin walls of Fisher's house came the sound of children coughing and his wife's voice trying to coax warmth back into numb fingers. Fisher looked up from his axe work and shook his head. "Burned through 2 weeks of wood in 4 days," he said. "Stove couldn't keep up. Found the baby's water cup with ice in it this morning. Right there beside the firebox." He gestured toward his house where smoke poured thick and black from the chimney. "Iron's so hot you can't touch it, but the heat just shoots straight up and out. Upstairs might as well be outside." Across the prairie settlement, the story repeated itself with grim consistency. The Andersons had moved their entire family into one room, sleeping on the floor around their cast iron heater. The Johanssons discovered frost on the inside of their north-facing windows, despite keeping their fire stoked all night. Old Niels Peterson, the settlement's most experienced builder, admitted his own house had dropped to 28 degrees in the back bedroom during the worst of the cold snap. The iron stoves had seemed like the obvious choice when the families first settled the prairie. The Sears Roebuck catalog promised efficient heating for farmhouses, and the local hardware supplier in town stocked a dozen models with detailed installation instructions. Cast iron was modern, affordable at $35, and required only basic masonry work for the chimney. Every building manual recommended the same approach: install the stove in the main room, run a straight flue to the roof, heat the air, and let convection carry warmth throughout the house. But the Minnesota prairie winter had exposed the fatal flaw in that logic. The fierce northwest winds that swept across the open farmland hit the houses like a frozen river, stripping heat from the walls faster than the stoves could replace it. The cast iron shells absorbed the fire's energy quickly, but released it just as fast, creating a cycle of intense heat near the stove and bitter cold everywhere else. Families found themselves clustered within 6 feet of the firebox, while the outer rooms became uninhabitable. Hans Larsen had followed the same path as his neighbors initially, but he carried something they did not: the memory of Swedish winters and his father's voice explaining why their family's kakelugn had kept their cottage warm through the long, Smoland nights. In the old country, his father had been a tile setter who understood the craft of building masonry heaters that captured fire's energy in brick and stone, then released it slowly over many hours. When Larsen first mentioned adapting his father's techniques to Minnesota conditions, the reaction was swift and dismissive. County Extension Agent John Reed visited the settlement that spring and heard Larsen's plans to build a large masonry stove clad in ceramic tiles. Reed shook his head and pulled out his official recommendations. "Those old European methods are expensive luxury," he told the gathered farmers. "Cast iron stoves are proven technology. What you need is better wood, maybe a second stove for the upstairs rooms. Don't waste money on fancy masonry that won't heat any better than good American iron." The other settlers nodded in agreement. Building a masonry heater would require weeks of work, specialized materials, and skills most of them didn't possess. The cast iron approach was simple: unpack the stove, connect the pipe, and start burning. Thomas Fisher spoke for many when he said, "Hans, we came here to farm, not to become stonemasons." Keep it simple and spend your time on what matters. But Larsson had also been listening to other voices. During the previous summer, he had worked on a barn-raising project with Chief Makwa, an Ojibwe elder whose band maintained winter camps north of the settlement. Makwa had observed the Swedish immigrant houses with interest, noting how they sat exposed to the prevailing winds without shelter or strategic orientation. In our winter lodges, Makwa had explained, we think about where the cold comes from and how to turn it aside. The lodge faces away from the winter wind, and we build earth banks and plant windbreak trees. The fire is not just heat, but how the heat stays. These conversations planted seeds in Larsson's mind about the relationship between building placement, wind protection, and heating efficiency. He began to see that the problem might not be just the type of stove, but the entire approach to winter survival on the prairie. By autumn of 1889, Larsson had made his decision. He would spend the fall months building a heating system that combined his father's Swedish masonry techniques with the site wisdom he had learned from Makwa. The neighbors watched with skepticism as he began laying out plans for a massive tile-clad stove that would weigh nearly 3,000 pounds and require internal flues that snaked through the masonry mass before exiting to the chimney. "You're building a monument, not a heater," Fisher commented, as he watched Larsson sketching the firebox dimensions. "All that stone and tile work will cost you more than 3 regular stoves, and you'll still be cold come January." Reed made another visit that October and found Larsson mixing clay mortar and sorting fire bricks. "I've seen men get obsessed with complicated solutions," the agent warned. "The simple fact is that heat rises and iron conducts heat efficiently. Your Swedish contraption will take forever to heat up and won't throw heat any better than a good Acme cast iron model." But Larsson had committed to testing a different principle entirely. Instead of heating air quickly and losing it to the wind and walls, he would capture the fire's energy and thermal mass and release it as steady radiant warmth. Instead of fighting the prairie's harsh conditions with brute force, he would work with the landscape's patterns of wind and shelter. The conventional wisdom said heat meant hot air and fast burning. His father's tradition said heat meant stored energy and slow release. The stage was set for a winter that would prove which approach could survive the prairie's coldest test. That November, before Hans Larsson could even think about building his masonry stove, he had to solve a more fundamental problem. His farmhouse sat in exactly the wrong place for surviving prairie winters. Like every other settler, he had built with the front door facing the township road and the long side of the house parallel to his property line, following the surveyor's grid rather than the land's natural patterns. This meant 30 feet of north and west wall took the full brunt of the prevailing winds that roared across the open prairie with nothing to slow them down. Larsson discovered just how critical this positioning was during a November storm when 50-mile-per-hour gusts hammered his house for 6 straight hours. He walked through his rooms with a candle, watching the flame bend and flicker as cold air infiltrated through gaps he couldn't even see. The north wall felt like touching ice, and when he pressed his hand against the interior surface, the wood was so cold it burned his palm. Using a mercury thermometer borrowed from the town doctor, he measured the wall temperature at 15 degrees Fahrenheit, while the room air registered 42 degrees just 3 feet away. The wind wasn't just making the house cold, it was actively stealing heat from every surface it touched. Outside, the moving air stripped away the thin layer of still air that should have provided insulation around the building. Inside, the cold walls acted like enormous heat sinks, pulling warmth out of the room faster than any stove could replace it. Larsson realized that no matter how good his heating system, he was fighting a losing battle against the building's exposure to the elements. Chief Makwa visited during the first week of December and walked the perimeter of Larsson's farmstead with the careful attention of someone who understood how wind and cold moved across open ground. He pointed to the northwest corner where the prevailing winter winds hit the house without obstruction. "The cold river runs here," he said, gesturing along the path the wind followed. "You built your house in the middle of the river. Better to build beside it, in the calm water." Makwa explained how Ojibwe winter lodges were positioned to turn aside the worst winds while capturing warmth from the winter sun. The entrance faced southeast, away from the prevailing northwest flow, and the main living area backed up against natural windbreaks like stands of trees or rock outcroppings. When no natural shelter existed, they created it with earthworks and strategically placed materials. Following this guidance, Larsson began his site modifications in early December, working during the brief daylight hours when the temperature climbed above zero. He couldn't move his house, but he could change how the wind interacted with it. First, he hauled fieldstone from a creek bed 2 miles away, loading his wagon with rocks that ranged from 20 to 50 pounds each. Working in methodical rows, he built a low wall running northeast to southwest, positioned 100 feet upwind from his house. The windbreak wall stood 4 feet high and stretched for 60 feet, angled to deflect the northwest winds around his farmstead, rather than letting them slam directly into his walls. Larsson packed smaller stones into the gaps and banked earth against the base, creating a barrier that would force the wind up and over rather than through. Between the stones and the house, he planted a double row of young oak saplings salvaged from the creek bottom, spacing them 8 feet apart in a zigzag pattern that would eventually create a living windbreak. The wall construction took 3 weeks of dawn-to-dusk labor, but Larsson could measure its effect immediately. On the first calm morning after completion, he walked the perimeter again with his thermometer and found that the north wall now registered 28 degrees instead of 15, still cold but 13 degrees warmer than before the windbreak. The next modification addressed the problem of cold air rushing into the house every time someone opened the door. Standard frontier practice called for the main entrance to open directly into the living area, but this created a thermal disaster every time family members came and went. Each door opening sent a wave of sub-zero air across the floor, instantly chilling everyone in the room and forcing the heating system to work harder. Larsson built an external vestibule that extended 8 feet from his original front door, creating an airlock between outside and inside. The vestibule had double walls filled with straw insulation and 2 doors with a 5-foot space between them. When someone entered from outside, they passed through the outer door, closed it completely, then opened the inner door to the main house. This system prevented the direct exchange of heated and frigid air that had been undermining his heating efforts. Inside the vestibule, Larsson installed hooks for outer clothing and a bench for removing boots, following Makwa's advice about creating a transition space where people could adjust between outdoor and indoor conditions. The floor was laid with thick planks over a bed of sand that absorbed moisture from melting snow and ice. By January, the combined effect of windbreak and vestibule became measurable. During a blizzard that brought 25-mile-per-hour sustained winds and temperatures of minus 18 degrees, Larsson's house maintained 48 degrees in the main room using his old cast-iron stove, a full 8 degrees warmer than the same conditions had produced before the modifications. More importantly, the improvements changed how long heat lasted in the house. Previously, when the fire died down, room temperatures would drop 6 degrees in the first hour as cold walls and infiltrating air overwhelmed the stored warmth. With the windbreak reducing wind speed and the vestibule preventing direct air exchange, the temperature dropped only 2 degrees in that same first hour. Thomas Fisher watched these modifications with growing interest, especially after spending a bitter January morning in Larsson's house and noting how much more comfortable it felt than his own. "You're changing everything about how we think about winter," Fisher observed. "We all assumed the problem was getting more heat into the house. You're showing us it's about keeping heat from escaping." The thermal load calculations were stark. Before the site modifications, Larsson's house was losing an estimated 12,000 British thermal units per hour through wind-induced infiltration and wall cooling. After the windbreak and vestibule installation, that loss dropped to approximately 7,000 British thermal units per hour, a 40% reduction in the heating burden that any stove system would need to overcome. These site improvements set the stage for the masonry stove construction that would begin in February. Larsson had learned that heating a prairie farmhouse required thinking like a fortress builder. First establish defenses against the enemy, then build the systems to maintain comfort within those defenses. The old approach of relying on heating power alone was like trying to fill a bucket with holes in the bottom. With his farmstead now protected from the worst of the prairie winds, Hans Larsson faced the challenge of building a heating system unlike anything his Minnesota neighbors had seen. In February of 1890, working in the bitter cold of his barn, he began constructing what would become a 3,000-pound masonry heater based on Swedish kakelugn principles his father had taught him 20 years earlier. The heart of Larsson's design lay in understanding a fundamental difference between how cast iron and masonry handled fire's energy. Cast iron absorbed heat quickly and released it just as fast, creating intense but short-lived warmth. Masonry worked by an entirely different principle. It absorbed heat slowly during the burning process, stored that energy in its massive structure, and then released it steadily for 12 to 20 hours after the fire had died to embers. Larsson began by excavating a foundation pit 4 feet square and 18 inches deep in the center of his main room. He filled this with fieldstone and mortar, creating a base strong enough to support the enormous weight of the finished stove. The foundation extended 2 feet beyond the stove footprint on all sides, distributing the load across the floor joists and preventing the structure from settling unevenly. The firebox construction required techniques entirely different from installing a simple cast iron stove. Instead of a wide, shallow burning chamber, Larsson built a tall, narrow firebox measuring 18 inches wide, 12 inches deep, and 36 inches high. The walls were constructed from specially ordered fire brick that could withstand temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit without cracking. He lined the firebox with a double layer of these fire bricks, leaving a 1-inch air gap between the inner and outer walls to prevent heat from escaping directly outward. Above the firebox, Larsson created the system that would distinguish his heater from any conventional stove, a maze of internal flues that forced the hot combustion gases to travel through the masonry mass before exiting to the chimney. Where a cast iron stove sent gases straight up and out in 8 feet of direct path, Larsson's design created 30 feet of twisting passageways through the masonry body. The flue system worked like this. Hot gases rose from the firebox into a primary chamber, then were forced down through a narrow passage along one side of the stove, back up through a second channel, down again through a third passage, and finally up through a fourth flue before reaching the chimney connection. Each passage was lined with fire brick and measured 4 inches by 6 inches in cross-section, sized precisely to maintain proper draft while maximizing heat transfer time. Building these internal passages required meticulous planning and execution. Larsson used wooden forms to create the flue shapes, building the masonry around them course by course, then burning out the wooden forms once the mortar had cured. Each passage had to maintain proper slope and smooth walls to prevent creosote buildup and ensure adequate draft. A mistake in the flue configuration would render the entire system useless. The outer shell presented its own technical challenges. Larsson wanted to clad his heater in decorative ceramic tiles like the kakelugns of his childhood, but importing Swedish tiles would cost more than his entire annual farm income. Instead, he found a German immigrant brickmaker in nearby St. Cloud who could produce glazed ceramic tiles in traditional patterns. These tiles served both aesthetic and functional purposes. The glazed surface radiated heat more efficiently than rough masonry, and the tile backing provided additional thermal mass. The tile installation required a specialized mortar that could expand and contract with temperature changes without cracking. Larsson mixed his own compound using local clay, lime, sand, and chopped straw, following a formula his father had taught him. Each tile was set individually with careful attention to joint spacing and alignment, creating a surface that would remain intact through years of heating cycles. By late March, the basic structure was complete, standing 7 feet tall and measuring 4 feet square at the base, tapering to 30 inches square at the top. The total weight approached 2,800 pounds, making it by far the heaviest single object in any farmhouse in the township. The masonry mass included approximately 1,200 pounds of fire brick, 800 pounds of common brick and stone, 600 pounds of tile and mortar, and 200 pounds of iron components including the loading door, ash cleanout, and damper mechanisms. Larsson's first test burn revealed both the promise and the complexity of his system. He loaded the firebox with seasoned oak and lit a modest fire, then monitored temperatures throughout the structure using mercury thermometers placed at various locations. The internal flue temperatures climbed rapidly to over 1,000 degrees, while the exterior tile surface reached only 140 degrees after 2 hours of burning. This temperature differential proved the system was capturing and storing heat rather than letting it escape immediately. However, the initial results also showed problems with his flue design. The fire burned sluggishly, producing excessive smoke, and the draft seemed insufficient to maintain clean combustion. After consulting with a local mason who had experience with European-style chimneys, Larsson realized his passages were too narrow and poorly sloped. He spent the next 2 weeks rebuilding sections of the internal flue system, widening the passages to 6 inches by 8 inches and improving the slope to ensure proper gas flow. The modified system performed dramatically better. A 2-hour burn with 20 pounds of seasoned hardwood produced clean, almost smokeless combustion and heated the 3,000-pound masonry mass to an average temperature of 160 degrees. More importantly, the stored heat continued radiating into the room for 14 hours after the fire died, maintaining the tile surface at 90 degrees even when the outside temperature dropped to -5 degrees Fahrenheit. Thomas Fisher witnessed one of these extended heating cycles and marveled at the difference from his cast iron experience. "Your stove stays warm to the touch at breakfast time from a fire you built at supper," he observed. "My iron stove is cold as a stone 1 hour after the fire dies." The measurement data supported Fisher's observation. Larsson's masonry heater maintained useful heat output for 12 to 16 hours per firing, compared to the 2 to 3 hours typical of cast iron stoves. The fuel efficiency gains were equally impressive. Where Fisher's cast iron stove required reloading every 4 hours to maintain comfort, consuming approximately 6 cords of wood per month, Larsson's system needed firing only twice daily and used roughly 3.5 cords per month for equivalent heating. The longer burn cycles and higher combustion efficiency meant each log contributed more useful heat and less wasted energy up the chimney. By April, word of Larsson's heating success had spread throughout the settlement, setting the stage for the ultimate test that would come with the next winter's storms. Even with his masonry heater performing beyond expectations, Hans Larsson discovered during the spring thaw of 1890 that his heating battle was only half won. As he walked through his house on a mild April morning, he noticed telltale signs of ongoing heat loss that his tile stove couldn't overcome. Condensation stains on interior walls where warm air had met cold surfaces, draft patterns visible in dust accumulation along baseboards, and upstairs rooms that remained stubbornly cold despite the powerful radiant system below. The problem became clear during a late April cold snap, when outside temperatures dropped to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Even with his masonry heater radiating steady warmth, Larsson measured significant temperature variations throughout the house. The main room maintained a comfortable 58 degrees, but the upstairs bedrooms struggled to reach 48 degrees, and the northeast corner room, used for storage, barely climbed above 42 degrees. His heating system was working perfectly, but the building envelope was hemorrhaging that carefully generated warmth. Larsson's investigation revealed that his house suffered from the same envelope failures plaguing every farmhouse on the prairie. The single-pane windows leaked cold air through gaps in their sash construction, creating downdrafts that pulled heat away from occupied spaces. The attic insulation consisted of only 4 inches of loose sawdust that had settled unevenly, leaving thermal bridges where cold penetrated directly through the ceiling. Most critically, the interior wall surfaces on the north and west sides remained cold enough to absorb radiant heat from his tile stove, essentially turning his carefully stored thermal energy into a losing battle against frigid wall surfaces. The window problem demanded immediate attention. Larsson's double-hung windows were typical frontier construction. Single glass panes set in wooden sash with simple rope and pulley mechanisms that left numerous gaps for air infiltration. On calm winter days, he could feel cold air streaming through these gaps with his hand, and during windy conditions, the infiltration created noticeable drafts throughout the room. Working with lumber salvaged from an old barn, Larsson constructed interior storm sash that fit snugly inside the existing window frames. These secondary glazing systems created an insulating airspace between the original window and the storm sash, reducing both conductive heat loss through the glass and infiltration through the frame gaps. Each storm sash was fitted with wool felt weather stripping around its edges and secured with turn button fasteners that allowed easy removal for cleaning or summer storage. The storm sash installation required precise measurement and fitting. Larson used a marking gauge to ensure uniform clearance around each frame, maintaining a half-inch air gap between the original window and the storm glazing. He sealed the storm sash frames with a mixture of pine pitch and oakum, creating airtight joints that eliminated the drafts that had undermined his heating efforts. The attic insulation upgrade presented a more complex challenge. Larson's German neighbor, Wilhelm Müller, had experimented with straw bale insulation in his barn and reported excellent thermal performance. Müller explained that properly prepared straw, when layered correctly, trapped large volumes of still air while remaining resistant to settling and rodent infiltration. Following Müller's guidance, Larson purchased 12 tons of wheat straw from a nearby farm and spent 3 weeks in May preparing it for insulation use. He spread the straw in thin layers on his barn floor, allowing it to dry completely and checking for any signs of mold or pest infestation. The straw was then cut to uniform 18-inch lengths using a hay knife, creating loose fill that could be worked into tight spaces while maintaining its insulating properties. The attic installation required removing the existing floor planking to access the joist spaces. Larson first laid down a vapor barrier of heavy canvas treated with linseed oil to prevent moisture from the living space below from reaching the straw. Over this barrier, he distributed the prepared straw to a depth of 12 inches, ensuring complete coverage without compression that would reduce insulating value. The original floor planks were then reinstalled, creating a sealed thermal barrier between the heated living space and the unheated attic. But Larson's most innovative envelope modification addressed the persistent problem of cold interior wall surfaces. Chief Makwa had observed that Ojibwe winter lodges included a thermal buffer strategy, an unheated but enclosed space on the cold side of the main living area that intercepted the worst of the exterior cold before it could reach the occupied rooms. Adapting this principle to his farmhouse design, Larson converted his northeast storage room into a controlled buffer zone. Instead of sealing this room completely from the main house, he created a system of adjustable vents that allowed limited air circulation while maintaining the room at an intermediate temperature between outside and inside conditions. The buffer room absorbed the initial impact of cold penetrating through the north and east walls, so the main living space only had to overcome the moderately cool temperature of the buffer room rather than fighting the full exterior cold. Within the main living area, Larson applied another technique borrowed from Scandinavian building traditions, interior wall plastering designed to improve thermal performance. Working with local clay deposits and lime obtained from a kilnworks in St. Cloud, he mixed a specialized plaster that included chopped straw fiber for reinforcement and crushed mica for improved thermal conductivity. This clay-lime plaster was applied in 2 coats to the interior surfaces of all north and west-facing walls. The first coat, applied directly to the log walls, was mixed thick with extra fiber to fill gaps and create a uniform base. The finished coat included a higher proportion of lime and mica, creating a smooth surface that reflected radiant heat back into the room rather than absorbing it into cold wall mass. The plaster system worked by equalizing temperature variations across the wall surface and providing thermal mass that could store and release radiant heat from the tile stove. Instead of cold spots and hot spots creating convection currents that wasted energy, the plastered walls maintained more uniform temperatures and worked in harmony with the radiant heating system. Testing these envelope improvements through the summer and early fall of 1890, Larson documented dramatic performance gains. The storm sash windows reduced measured infiltration by an estimated 60% based on smoke tests conducted on calm days. The straw insulation upgrade cut heat loss through the ceiling by approximately 70%, measured by comparing upstairs temperature retention before and after installation. Most significantly, the combination of buffer zone and interior plaster eliminated the cold wall syndrome that had been undermining his radiant heating system. Wall surface temperatures on the interior north side improved from an average of 35 degrees to 46 degrees during cold weather, reducing the thermal gradient that had been pulling heat away from the living space. By October, Thomas Fisher had witnessed enough of these envelope improvements to begin planning similar modifications to his own house. "You figured out something the rest of us missed," Fisher admitted. "It's not just about making heat, it's about keeping the heat where you want it and stopping it from going where you don't." These envelope techniques would prove their worth during the legendary winter of 1891, when the combination of Larsen's masonry heating system and building improvements would face the ultimate test of prairie survival. The winter of 1891 arrived with a vengeance that old-timers would remember for decades. By the second week of January, a high-pressure system settled over the upper Midwest and refused to move, bringing 10 consecutive days of temperatures that never climbed above minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Nighttime lows plunged to minus 32 degrees, and sustained winds of 20 to 30 miles per hour created wind chill conditions that made outdoor work deadly within minutes. Hans Larsen's integrated heating system faced its ultimate test during this Arctic siege, while his neighbors struggled with heating failures that threatened both comfort and survival. Thomas Fisher's cast iron stove, pushed to its absolute limits, required reloading every 3 hours around the clock. Fisher and his older son took shifts throughout each night, one sleeping while the other maintained the fire, because letting the stove go cold for more than 4 hours meant waking to indoor temperatures in the 20s. The fuel consumption rates during this period revealed the stark differences between the competing approaches. Fisher burned through 8 cords of seasoned oak in those 10 days, requiring daily trips to his woodpile in conditions that froze exposed skin in less than 5 minutes. His neighbors, the Andersons and Johanssons, faced similar demands on their wood supplies, with some families burning furniture and fence posts when their carefully hoarded firewood ran low. Larsen's performance during the same period demonstrated the cumulative effect of his integrated site, thermal mass, and envelope improvements. He fired his masonry heater twice daily, once at 6 in the evening and once at 6 in the morning, using approximately 40 pounds of wood per firing. This schedule meant he spent only 2 hours per day actively tending his heating system, compared to the round-the-clock vigilance required by his neighbors. The temperature measurements told an even more compelling story. During the coldest night of the siege, when outside temperatures reached minus 32 degrees with 25-mile-per-hour winds, Larsen's main room maintained 54 degrees Fahrenheit. More remarkably, his upstairs bedroom stayed at 49 degrees, and even his buffer room registered 38 degrees, warmer than many of his neighbors' main living areas. County Extension Agent John Reed visited the settlement during the worst of the cold spell, officially documenting heating performance as part of his winter survival assessment. Reed found Fisher's house struggling to maintain 42 degrees in the main room, with upstairs areas dropping to 28 degrees despite the cast iron stove glowing red hot. The Johansson family had moved everyone into one room and was burning their kitchen table to supplement their dwindling wood supply. When Reed entered Larsen's house, he immediately noticed the difference. The air felt warm and stable, without the dramatic temperature zones that characterized houses heated by convection stoves. Reed's official thermometer readings confirmed what he could feel. Larsen's house was not only warmer overall, but maintained much more even temperatures throughout all rooms. More significantly, Reed observed a phenomenon that contradicted everything he thought he knew about frontier heating. Even 6 hours after Larsen's evening firing, when the masonry stove's tile surface had cooled to 100 degrees, the house continued to feel comfortable, and the interior walls remained warm to the touch. The stored thermal energy was still radiating heat at a rate that matched the building's heat loss, creating equilibrium rather than the constant battle against cooling that characterized cast iron stove performance. Reed's measurements revealed that Larsen's fuel consumption during the 10-day siege totaled 4½ cords, compared to the 8 to 10 cords his neighbors required for significantly less comfort. Even more impressive, Larsen had achieved this efficiency while maintaining his normal daily routine, sleeping full nights, and never facing the exhaustion that was wearing down families who had to maintain constant fire vigilance. The social dynamics in the settlement shifted dramatically during this extreme weather test. Families who had previously dismissed Larsen's complex system as impractical began appearing at his door, not just for warmth, but to study his methods. Wilhelm Müller, the German immigrant who had helped with straw insulation techniques, spent an entire afternoon measuring temperatures throughout Larsson's house and examining the masonry heater's construction details. Müller's observations led to the first systematic attempt to understand and replicate Larsson's approach. Working with detailed measurements and sketches, Müller began planning modifications to his own farmhouse that would incorporate the windbreak, envelope sealing, and buffer zone concepts. He lacked the masonry skills to build a tile-clad heater, but he recognized that even partial implementation of Larsson's principles could dramatically improve his heating performance. The vindication extended beyond individual households. Dr. Edward Harrison, a physician from the county seat who traveled between farms during the siege to check on families, documented cases of frostbite, respiratory illness, and exhaustion among settlers whose heating systems had failed to maintain adequate indoor conditions. Harrison noted in his medical journal that the Larsson household showed none of these stress indicators, despite facing identical outdoor conditions. By the spring of 1892, 3 families in the settlement had commissioned masonry contractors from St. Paul to build tile-clad heaters based on Larsson's design. Thomas Fisher invested $200, nearly half his annual farm income, in a complete heating system upgrade that included envelope improvements, a simplified masonry heater, and site modifications. Fisher's investment reflected his recognition that heating system failure could cost far more than the price of proper equipment. The broader adoption process revealed both the power and the complexity of Larsson's integrated approach. Families who installed masonry heaters without addressing envelope and site issues achieved only modest improvements. Those who implemented partial envelope upgrades with cast iron stoves saw significant gains, but nothing approaching Larsson's performance levels. The settlers began to understand that the revolutionary performance came not from any single technique, but from the systematic integration of multiple complementary strategies. Martin Hansen, a heating contractor from Minneapolis, visited the settlement that fall and spent 2 weeks documenting the various heating systems and their performance characteristics. Hansen's detailed measurements and cost analyses formed the basis for his company's expansion into rural masonry heater installation, bringing Swedish-style heating technology to immigrant communities throughout Minnesota and Wisconsin. The legacy of that bitter winter extended far beyond the immediate settlement. Agricultural extension services began recommending site orientation and windbreak strategies for new farmstead development. Building supply companies started stocking materials for envelope improvements and offering guidance on storm sash construction. Most significantly, the combination of immigrant craft traditions with indigenous site wisdom had proven superior to conventional frontier building practices, validating the value of cross-cultural technical knowledge in surviving the American prairie.